Brian Randell, through such devious things as writing a letter to the Prime Minister of Great Britain and things of that nature, has been very successful in applying pressure, which has resulted in the ability to get pieces of information which up until now have been unavailable. He and Dr. Coombs, who was one of the principals in the Colossus, are going to now tell us about some of the newly available results in this area. Brian?
Ladies and gentlemen, it's a great privilege for me to share this platform with a large number of the famous computer pioneers. It's an even greater privilege that I can now play some part in ensuring that some other computer pioneers can now receive the public recognition, indeed fame, that I believe is long overdue to them. In October 1975, after an official silence lasting some 32 years, the British government made available at the Public Record Office a set of captioned photographs of the Colossus. This information confirms that a series of programmable electronic digital computers was built in Britain during World War II, the first being operational in 1943. Professor M.H.A. Newman is named as being responsible for formulating the requirement for Colossus, and Mr. T.H. Flowers as leading the team which developed the machine. An indication is given that the design of Colossus was influenced by the pre-war work on computability by Alan Turing, who was employed in the same department of the British government as Newman. During recent years, a few details about the Colossi have been disclosed by some of the people involved. These were summarized by Donald Mickey in a 2-page article. The present release provides welcome confirmation that this brief summary was indeed, in general, quite accurate. The release goes further and provides further information. However, it makes it clear, by implication, that the British government, still regards the detailed logical design and the use made of the Colossi as classified. Fortunately, the security relaxations have been sufficient for me to obtain assistance in interviewing a considerable number of the people involved in both the design and use of the Colossi. This lecture is in the main based on material I've obtained from these interviews, supplemented by material in the public domain. Because of the rather sensitive nature of this, my paper is one that I am sticking to much more closely than I would normally in giving a lecture. In particular, I would like to read the sentence, "To the best of my knowledge and belief, I've managed to collate all the releasable and verifiable information on Colossus and its significance in the history of computers. But, a word of warning, this work was done in great secrecy. The people I've talked to have had no opportunity of seeing the original files and documents such as exist. They made conscious efforts in many cases to forget what they did during the war when they left the Foreign Office or wherever else they were in 1945. Security considerations were so paramount that on the need-to-know basis, very few people had the complete picture. Therefore, only if and when the files of the Foreign Office's Department of Communications are released will it be seen that the present account is fragmentary and far from exact. Moreover, only then will it be possible to see the Colossus in its true perspective as a tool developed for a particular, very important and urgent wartime need. My present account has perforce to concentrate on Colossus itself, and so runs the risk of providing a very distorted account of the events that it attempts to chronicle. May I have the first slide, please? Alan Turing's famous paper on computable numbers was published in 1937 and based on work that he did at King's College, Cambridge. Next slide, please. M.H.A. Newman was at King's College, was at Cambridge at that time. He'd been there since 1924, and it's believed that Turing's work on computable numbers derived or started by a lecture by Newman. Newman discussed Hilbert's view that any mathematical problem could be solved by a fixed and definite process. Turing seized on Newman's phraseology a purely mechanical process and introduced a simple abstract machine in order to prove that Hilbert was wrong. In fact, he showed that there is a universal automaton which can perform any calculation that any special automaton can, if first provided with the appropriate instructions as input. Turing was thus the first, in my opinion, to arrive at an understanding of the universal nature of a conceptual, general-purpose digital computer, which matches and indeed surpasses the philosophic understanding that I believe that Babbage and Lady Lovelace had. In September 1936, Turing left Cambridge and spent a year at Princeton University, where the staff included Church, Courant, Hardy, Einstein, and von Neumann. He went back to Britain for the summer of 1937, returned to Princeton, received his PhD there in 1938. Von Neumann was enormously intrigued with Turing's idea of a universal automaton and offered Turing a post as his assistant. Next slide, please. Just for the record, von Neumann. The offer was refused, and Turing returned in 1938 to King's College, Cambridge. According to the biography written by his mother, Turing was taken on as a temporary civil servant in the Foreign Office in the Department of Communications immediately on the declaration of war, 1939. But at first, even his whereabouts were kept secret, though it was later divulged that he was working at Bletchley Park. Next slide, please. The nature of the work that was undertaken at Bletchley Park during World War II is still officially secret, but statements have appeared in the newspapers and books in recent years which strongly suggest that it included an important part of the British government's cryptologic effort. It was referred to briefly by Kahn in the Codebreakers. Muggeridge described it as a manor house where the staff were a curious mixture of mathematicians, dons of various kinds, chess and crossword maestros, and an odd musician or two. It's been said that it housed the Government Code and Cipher School, which was also known to its inmates as the Golf Club and Chess Society. Bletchley is referred to in Winterbottom's book, The Ultra Secret. But there's just a brief mention of the idea that computers and electronics were used to help the backroom boys of Bletchley. Subsequently, in a lengthy newspaper article, it was stated that the work at Bletchley involved machines called bombs, B-O-M-B-E-S, which were prototype computers. The recently published book, Bodyguard of Lies, by A.C. Brown, also refers to a machine called the Bomb, which was designed by Turing and built by a team at the British Tabulating Machine Company, led by Harold Keane. But there are quotations to suggest that the bomb was not a computer, nor a complex tabulating machine. I can in no way vouch for the accuracy of these various statements, even though some of them are most impressively detailed. My investigation has concentrated on Colossus, and there seems no doubt that the work on Colossus postdates by a couple of years or so the events that Brown and Winterbottom and others claim occurred. In fact, this adds credence to the statement by David Kahn that it was in order to solve other problems that, and I quote, the Bletchley geniuses evolved perhaps the first modern electronic computer, which they nicknamed Colossus. However, questions concerning the use of Colossus are outside the scope of my paper, and I'm afraid this talk. Next slide, please. In 1941, Mr. T.H. Flowers was in charge of a 50-man switching group at the Dollis Hill Post Office Research Station. Even at this early date, he had considerable experience of electronics, having started research on the use of electronic valves for telephone switching in 1931. He'd worked on a great variety of different topics and had a small amount of involvement with computing. He knew of the Manchester differential analyzer, he had met beavers, mentioned by Professor Booth yesterday. And in 1941, February 1941, he was approached via Dr. W.G. Radley, the director of the research station, to work on a problem for Bletchley Park. Dr. C. Wynne Williams was, with Turing, among the first people that Flowers met at Bletchley Park. It was Dr. Wynne Williams who, at the Cavendish Laboratory in 1930 and 1931, built the first electronic digital counters. Wynne Williams, when war broke out in 1939, joined the radar program at the Telecommunications Research Establishment, as it became known. Flowers' next 6 months or so were spent building a special-purpose electromechanical device for Bletchley Park, and in doing so interacted mainly with Turing and W. Gordon Welchman. Welchman was Assistant Director for Mechanization at Bletchley Park. After the war, he went to the States, headed the applications research side of the Whirlwind computer project, and I gather gave the first course on digital computers at the EE department at MIT. Next slide, please. During this period, one of Flowers' colleagues at Dollis Hill, S.W. Broadhurst, was brought in to help with the project as soon as his security vetting could be completed. Broadhurst's forte was electromechanical equipment. They built a device for Turing which involved the use of high-speed rotary switches. It was a straightforward engineering job with nothing in the way of arithmetic or programming facilities, and the project turned out to be unsuccessful because the initial requirement that was specified turned out to be a considerable factor of speed too low. Next slide, please. At about this stage, another of Flowers' staff, Bill Chandler, joined in the work for Bletchley Park. He had been at Dollis Hill since 1936 and was similarly skilled in electronics. In fact, he believes he had been involved in the first ever use of thermionic valves for switching purposes in the post office communications. Broadhurst, Flowers, and Chandler became involved in a quite different project at Bletchley Park, one on which both Wynne Williams and Harold Keane were working. The basic problem was to provide a very much faster of an earlier electromechanical device that BTM had built. There were at least two different approaches to this, one by Wynne Williams, one by Keane. They got involved in both of them in trying to apply electronics to the problem. It was through these various activities that they had established themselves as the leading exponents of electronics at Bletchley, in time, as it turned out, for the beginning of the project that led to the Colossus. Next slide, please. The staff at Bletchley Park were divided into different sections, each in general housed in different huts in the grounds. That is a present-day picture of Bletchley Park, with two of the original wartime huts visible there on the right. One such section was headed by Major Tester. It was working on yet another problem using pencil and paper rather than mechanized procedures. The section and its work were known as the testery, and it was this section that Donald Mickey joined in 1942. In the testery, Mickey was taught to carry out a particular procedure, a particular manual procedure, and in the process was referred back to Turing. Turing having had some work on developing the procedure from its original form, which was designed by W.T. Tutt. MHA Newman reached Bletchley Park in September 42, and like Mickey, had originally been assigned to the testery. The work there required an extraordinary type of ingenuity, rather akin to solving crossword puzzles, and Newman soon realized he was no good at it and thought of resigning, going back to Cambridge. He had not been drafted and had the chance of doing so. But he had an idea whereby Tutt's procedure could be mechanized. And he went to Commander Travis, the head at Bletchley Park, and obtained authorization to set up a new section for this purpose, which was housed in what was known as Hut F. Wynne Williams undertook to develop the required machine, and it was this machine that became known as the Heath Robinson, after a cartoonist in Britain who would be the analogue of Rube Goldberg, the cartoonist in the States. The techniques used in Newman's section, the Newmanry, would still involve a great deal of mathematical skill, so he started to assemble a team of mathematicians. The first to arrive were Mickey and I.J. Good. Good had joined Bletchley Park in 1941, and at Bletchley his first 18 months or so were spent in a section headed by Turing, for whom he acted as a statistical assistant. He and Mickey, with some 30 Wrens as machine operators and a few electronic engineers, formed Newman's entire staff during the early part of the Robinson era. That would be for the initial few months. The summary published by Mickey about the Heath Robinson said that it incorporated 2 synchronized photoelectric paper tape readers capable of reading 2,000 characters per second. 2 loops of 5-hole tape, typically more than 1,000 characters in length, would be mounted on these readers. Counts were made of any desired Boolean function of the 2 inputs. Fast counting was performed electronically, and slow operations, such as the later stages of the counters and the control of the output equipment, was performed by relays. The machine and all its successors were entirely automatic in operation once started and incorporated an online teleprinter or typewriter. That last part is in fact incorrect. They included a entirely novel line printer, a drum line printer, which had been designed at TRE by Mr. Tom Gifford. The Heath Robinson and a number of similar machines which went by such names as Peter Robinson and Cleaver, the names of stores in London, were built through the combined efforts of teams at TRE, the radar establishment, and Dollis Hill, the post office establishment. When Williams undertook to produce the electronic counters, but recommended that a post office telegraph engineer be given the tape driving and reading problem. Thus, Mr. F.O. Morrell, head of the telegraph group at Dollis Hill, became involved. He commissioned Dr. Spate and Mr. Lynch of the physics group to produce a photoelectric reader. They were not told the intended purpose of the photoelectric reader, which they knew as the Mark I telegraph transmitter, or more exactly, the transmitter, telegraph, Mark I, as the Army would use. Their first design was a prototype, and their second one was a more considered design, and both designs used double crescent masks. Next slide, please. Double crescent masks in order to produce a nearly rectangular pulse of light as a circular hole crossed the mask. The mask was about that size. I now possess one, the only one known to exist. Morrell took Spate and Lynch's reader and used the output from the sprocket holes as a carrier, which he phase modulated with the character hole outputs to derive pulses which were to be counted, thus demonstrating that he was not a switching engineer. He also produced an auxiliary machine that was used to produce the tapes that formed one of the 2 inputs to the Heath Robinson. This was a straightforward piece of mechanical engineering, but involved switches and plug boards, so that input data could be set up on the plug boards and the keys used to control the choice and sequencing of the data. The TRE and Dollis Hill halves of the Heath Robinson were put together at Bletchley Park in April '43. At the start, there were very considerable reliability problems, particularly to do with paper tape, because of the harm that the sprocket drives did to the sprocket holes as they tried to keep the 2 tapes synchronized. The machine also tended to produce different answers, even when run with the same data repeatedly, and according to Newman, had a tendency to seize up and catch fire. Moreover, it took some time to develop an effective methodology, so Newman came under tremendous pressure to obtain results, even though he remained exceedingly determined. With the aid of volunteer Wrens and maintenance engineers, Mickey and Good, working in the evenings, developed the methodology. And the activity paid off handsomely in that it completely proved the correctness of Newman's intentions. But although the Robinsons produced only a small amount of output that was of value in itself, they played an important role in preparing the way for Colossus. Sometime after the start of the Heath Robinson work, Flowers and Broadhurst, who had not known of it before, were brought into the project. Newman's impression is that this was a Turing suggestion. Flower's task was to produce a better electronic counter, but he soon decided that that way of trying to work and that way of trying to solve the tape reading problem was inappropriate. So he proposed a very different solution, one involving considerable electronic complexity. As one of his colleagues has put it, the basic thing about Flowers was that he didn't care about how many valves he used. He knew from his pre-war experience that most valve failures occurred when or shortly after power was switched on. He thus realized that given appropriate design procedures, electronic equipment which could be left on permanently could be expected to achieve a high level of reliability, though this remained to be proven in a large machine. So he proposed that he and his colleagues design and build a machine which was to have no less than 1,500 valves. This is, as far as I can ascertain, considerably in excess of anything else that had been tried up to that time in Britain or the United States for radar or for purposes of logical or numerical calculation. Indeed, this is nearly twice the number of valves that were used in the Pilot Ace computer built at NPL after the war. They did not get official support from Bletchley Park, and instead did it under the authorization of Randell at Dollis Hill. In the incredibly short space of 11 months, the machine which Bletchley Park were to christen Colossus was built. The photoelectric radar was based on the original Spate Lynch one, but redesigned to work at 5,000 characters per second. It was commissioned at Bletchley Park in December 43. The first job that was run on Colossus happened to take only 10 minutes. It could equally well, depending on the input, have taken several hours. Moreover, when it was repeated, it produced exactly the same results. No wonder that, as Flowers put it, they just couldn't believe it when we brought this string and sealing wax sort of thing in and it actually did a job. They were on their beam ends at their time. Robinson just hadn't got enough output. They wouldn't go fast enough. And suddenly this bit of string and sealing wax in about 10 minutes. And then they started to take notice. What Flowers had done was generate some of the required data electronically within the machine, so that only one input tape was required. Furthermore, by using the pulses obtained from reading the sprocket holes to generate timing signals, the sprocket wheel itself was dispensed with. It therefore became necessary to provide means of setting up the machine before a run so as to have it generate the required sets of data from parameters stored on thyrotron rings. Can we have some of the Colossus slides, please? That is an overall view of the front rack of the Colossus. Next slide, please. A view showing that there, in fact, were two sets of racks. Next slide, please. The back view of the machine showing the thyrotron rings. For the purposes of setting data into the thyrotron rings, plug boards and sets of keys based on the original auxiliary machine were used. Slide, please. You will find that some of the markings on that plug board are legible and some are curiously illegible. After the first Colossus was made available to the mathematicians, they began to make use of it to do processes that were not possible on Robinson's by making the dynamically generated data dependent on the result of instantaneous processing. On the side of electronic design, the historically significant features of the prototype Colossus included the use of a clock pulse to synchronize and time operations throughout the machine. It was this feature that made the size of the machine possible. It used binary hard valve circuitry throughout, and thus achieved its reliability. Because it used two-state circuits and clock control, it could operate at any speed down to 0, and so could be hand-stepped for test purposes. Next slide, please. That shows some of the valves that were used. In particular, on the left there, the EF36, probably one of the more important valves within it. Next slide, please. I will just very quickly, because of time, show you some reconstructed circuit diagrams of some of the components of Colossus. There, the Boolean addition. Next. Binary addition. Next. The shift register, which was used in Colossus. Next. The biquinary counter, the bi part of the biquinary counter, so to speak. Next, please. And the quinary part of the biquinary counter. Next slide, please. The last major figure in the Colossus story, Doc Coombs, sitting in the front here, joined in at about the time the first machine was commissioned. He'd been brought into the Foreign Office work in October 43, originally to do work connected with Heath Robinson, but Colossus changed all that. As soon as the first Colossus was working, Flowers asked for good warning of requirements for any further machines. This wasn't forthcoming, but being suspicious, he nevertheless went ahead to get some of the time-consuming components manufactured. Then, in about March 1944, they were told that a number of further machines were required by June the 1st, 1944. There was no conceivable way of meeting this requirement, but Flowers undertook to get the production of an initial set of 3 machines started and to try and get one machine working by the deadline, March 44 to June 44. The production on Mark II machines were 5 times faster than the prototype. They had an effective speed of 25,000 characters per second, though the actual tape readers worked only at 5,000 characters per second, and shift registers were used to enable parallel working. Moreover, extra facilities were provided that had not been available on the Robinsons or the prototype Colossus. These facilities included wired logic processes and a logic switching panel, comprising rows of key switches on which Boolean functions could be set up to control the logical operations performed by the machine. The Mark II Colossus involved extensive redesign. The design work was divided up between Flowers, Broadhurst, Chandler, and Coombs, who remembers Flowers literally tearing up his basic logic diagram into pieces and handing one out each to be redesigned. The building of the machine was done in what was essentially a factory set up for the purpose at the Dollis Hill Research Station. To save time, the first Mark II machine was assembled on site at Bletchley Park. By May the 31st, 1944, it was nearly complete. Flowers, Broadhurst, Chandler, Coombs, and another individual, Saville, were all there, but they couldn't get the machine to work. Eventually, in the early hours of June the 1st, the others went home to get some sleep, leaving Chandler to work on. It had been decided the problem was in his part. In his words, the whole system was in a state of violent parasitic oscillation at a frequency outside the range of our oscilloscopes. And then, by way of diversion, at about 3 a.m., a nearby radiator started leaking, sending a pool of warm water towards the machine. He eventually found a means of curing the problem, and at nearly 4 a.m. left one of the maintenance engineers to finish the required rewiring. The others arrived back at 8:30 a.m. on June the 1st to find the machine was working. The deadline had been beaten, and it was just 5 days to D-Day, June the 6th, 1944. Several more Mark II Colossi were soon installed, and they involved various additional pieces of electronics. However, even the earliest Mark II machine involved 2,400 valves. They were all similar in appearance and similar to the prototype, and in fact the pictures that I've shown you are now believed to be of one of the Mark II machines rather than the prototype. Doc Coombs was placed in charge of the work in 1944 when Flowers was promoted, and design work continued right up to the end of the war, since no 2 colossi were exactly the same. Published claims have been made that a total of about 10 colossi were manufactured. The official caption states merely that after the first machine, a considerable number of further machines was built and gave reliable and effective service until the end of the war. What happened to them afterwards has not been revealed. Let me try and assess the colossi. Amongst the lists of features we are now told the colossi had were electronic storage registers changeable by an automatically controlled sequence of operations, conditional branching logic, logic functions preset by patch panels or switches, or conditionally selected by telephone relays, fully automatic operation, and other people have revealed that certainly the Mark II machines had variable programming by means of lever keys which controlled gates which could be connected in series or parallel as required, and that the machines calculated complicated Boolean functions involving up to about 100 symbols. It seems quite fair to classify the Colossi as at least a special-purpose, program-controlled electronic digital computer. It was, however, externally programmed, and there's no question of it being a stored program computer. There were other programmable computers in existence in 1944, but as far as is known, none were electronic. Digital electronics had, on the other hand, as far as we know, by this time, only been used for special-purpose, single-purpose devices. Next slide, please. One of the more complicated, I know, being the Atanasov machine, work on which was abandoned in 1942. Program control by means of plug boards was available on punch card machines and well known to Flowers and his team. In fact, he has assessed the prototype as being perhaps less programmable than some IBM machines. But the Mark II Colossus, because of the additional logic switching panel, was much more flexible than the prototype and turned out to have much more generality than Newman and his team had intended. And it ended up being used for several types of job which had not been anticipated when the machine was first designed, including some jobs which it had not been thought could ever be automated. It was used for a variety of tasks, but all directly related to the particular work that the Newmanry and the testery were concerned with. The machine that it is interesting to compare Colossus with is, of course, ENIAC. Next slide. ENIAC was obviously a much larger machine than Colossus. It had conditional branches and was programmable using plug cables. Like Colossus, it was built for a very special purpose. But it was used for a variety of other numerical calculations. The distinction between special purpose and general purpose digital computers is very blurred unless one equates general purpose to some sort of reasonable, albeit finite, approximation to a universal Turing machine. Neither Colossus nor ENIAC, therefore, is general purpose in this sense. This leaves the question of the relative extent to which ENIAC and Colossus were special purpose. Here, I think, all we can do is rely on the statements of the people who designed and used Colossus, and I will summarize those briefly by quoting Donald Mickey, who said that his impression was that the Colossus would not be very far away on the scale of ascent towards a general-purpose computer from the ENIAC. I think a reasonable summary would be that ENIAC and Colossus, which preceded it by nearly 2 years, were both program-controlled electronic digital computers. The one specialized towards numerical calculations, the other perhaps somewhat more specialized towards Boolean calculations of a particular type. Each was a splendid achievement and of great importance. But it was amongst the ENIAC group that the final step towards the modern computer was taken, namely the design of a practical stored program computer, the EDVAC. Newman's section expanded rapidly, even before the first Colossus was installed. Its hut was replaced by a brick building, still for convenience known as Hut F, and later another building, Hut H, was added in which some of the Colossi were housed. A number of mathematicians joined, and as Newman has put it, his section had a lot of outstanding people in it, and included some who were or were to become the best mathematicians in Britain. In addition to their mathematical duties, the mathematicians manned a duty rota. The operators were Wrens, with a senior Wren as chief operator, responsible for several machines and scheduling their job queues. It was a long time before those involved were to see again a room whose pattern of activity so closely matched that of a modern large computer installation. The Colossi achieved very high levels of reliability. The problems that they had were more to do with things like valve holders and paper tape than valves. One cannot attempt to picture the environments within which the Colossi were built and used without some appreciation of the circumstances under which the work at Bletchley Park and Dollis Hill was undertaken. Within Bletchley Park even, security precautions were applied. Discussion of the work would be avoided outside a particular hut. At lunchtime, Newman and a group of his staff might lunch together, but even in an otherwise empty cafeteria, there would be no thought of discussing their work. At Dollis Hill, very few people had any knowledge about Bletchley Park or the tasks undertaken on the machines. Paperwork was kept to a minimum. Flower's team were initially not allowed to use the drawing office, and circuit diagrams were drawn freehand. At Dollis Hill, the people had priority on stores and in the post office factories and did not have to account for anything. When they asked for automatic typewriters instead of teleprinters, these were provided from the States and flown over with reserved places, no questions asked. Perhaps the best anecdote is Chandler's, who remembers telephoning an official in the Ministry of Supply, yet again, to ask for another couple of thousand EF-36 valves, and being asked, "What the bloody hell are you doing with these things? Shooting them at the Jerrys?" The explanatory caption states that Turing's earlier work had its full influence on the design concept of the Colossus. Questions of influence are very hard to assess. Turing clearly was viewed with considerable awe by most of his colleagues at Bletchley because of his evident intellect and the great originality and importance of his contributions there, and by many with considerable discomfort because his personality was so outlandish. Many people found him incomprehensible, but all of the post office engineers who worked with him say that they found him very, very easy to understand. Their respect for him was immense, though, as Chandler said, the least said about him as an engineer, the better. Turing seems to have worked on a wide variety of mathematical topics during this period, and in fact, a very important statistical method he developed then was rediscovered and developed further later by Abraham Wald and is now known as sequential analysis. The early projects that the Dollis Hill people did were in close cooperation with Turing. His work on computability was well known, and virtually all of the people I've interviewed recollect wartime discussions of his idea of a universal automaton. Flowers, incidentally, also recalls lunchtime conversations with Newman and Turing about Babbage and his work. Good has written that Newman was perhaps inspired by his knowledge of Turing's 36 paper. However, Newman's view now is that although he and his people all knew that the planned Colossus was theoretically related to a Turing machine, they were not conscious of their work having any direct dependence on these ideas or those of Babbage. And Turing was not directly involved in Colossus or any of the meetings on Colossus. The one other aspect of Turing's role that I would dearly like to clarify is his reputed wartime meeting with von Neumann. The story, or rather the legend, is that the meeting was of critical importance to the development of the modern computer. The written paper summarizes a little more that I found out about Turing's visits to the States and von Neumann's visits to Britain. However, for my part, I'm now disinclined to believe the legend, though I think the situation was probably summarized well by Stan Frankel, when he wrote, "Many people have acclaimed von Neumann as the father of the computer, in a modern sense of the term, but I am sure that he would never have made that mistake himself. He might well be called the midwife, perhaps, but he firmly emphasized to me, and to others I am sure, that the fundamental conception is owing to Turing, insofar as not anticipated by Babbage, Lovelace, and others. In my view, von Neumann's essential role was in making the world aware of these fundamental concepts introduced by Turing, and of the development work carried out in the Moore School and elsewhere. Both von Neumann and Turing, of course, also made substantial contributions to the reduction to practice of these concepts. There is a chapter in my paper about the American scene, and there is no time to go through that, other than to summarize that Flowers and his colleagues did not learn about any of the American work on electronic or electromagnetic digital computers, such as at Bell Lab, Harvard, Iowa State, IBM, MIT, or the Moore School, until close to or after the end of the war. It's unclear to what extent scientists and engineers working at the Bell Labs, IBM, and elsewhere in the States on problems similar to those that Flowers was working on, were in touch with the work of Flowers and his team. but there's no evidence at all of any American involvement in the design of Colossus. Although special purpose machines were being developed in the States during the war, as is the case with Colossus, they are not as yet fully declassified. However, my correspondents were able to provide me with some details of the American work, enough, I believe, to put Colossus in a proper perspective. And there are several pages in the written paper summarizing the work on these special purpose devices by people such as Vannevar Bush, John Howard, Arnold Dumey, and Sam Williams of Bell Labs. My information is that there were no earlier or contemporary electronic machines in the American communications operations which matched the size or complexity of Colossus. Indeed, the statements I've received from both sides of the Atlantic concerning the Colossus indicate that it had no rivals or precedents as a programmable electronic computer, and that there were no links between it and the ENIAC project. I am pretty well certain that ENIAC received no advantage whatsoever from the work that was done on Colossus. Official awards were made to a number of people involved in the Bletchley Park work after the war, but of a quite inadequate nature in my opinion. Flowers was awarded an MBE and a £1,000 award to inventors. But as Coombs had said, if it had been £10,000 or £100,000, it wouldn't have been too much. Most of the group continued full-time work at Bletchley Park until the end of the war, but Flowers ceased after his promotion in 1944. He did take part in a visit of inspection to Germany on behalf of Bletchley Park 2 months after the cessation of hostilities, and the party included Alan Turing and the man who was in charge of work on radio reception for Bletchley Park. Flowers and Chandler visited the States in September 45, where they went to the Aberdeen Proving Ground, Bell Labs, Harvard, MIT, the Moore School, and Vermont. In all of these visits, of course, they had to avoid any mention of Colossus and be very discreet about their own expertise in digital electronics. Their visit must have been a very discreet one to ENIAC. Goldstein, who gives considerable detail about the sequence of early visitors to ENIAC, mentions only that in addition to Comrie, Hartree, and Womersley, 2 others connected with the British Post Office Research Station also came. After their return to Britain, Flowers, who had been involved in a data recorder project to do with radar, was taken off this work, and Doc Coombs replaced him. And for the next few years, he and Chandler worked together, first on the data recorder, then on computers. For a time, they worked closely with NPL, and so resumed close collaboration with Turing. Turing had produced a set of proposals for the ACE shortly after joining NPL. This report post-dated and referenced von Neumann's famous draft report on ENIAC, on EDVAC, but went considerably further than it, being much more detailed and containing the full concept of a stored program computer. In fact, it has been said that Turing's proposal is one of the first complete designs for a stored program computer, possibly the first, and that what we now regard as one of the fundamental characteristics of the von Neumann machine was, as far as we know, suggested independently, if not originally, by Turing. In von Neumann's report, data and instruction words were differentiated, and only the address field of an instruction could be modified. One of the points listed in the argument for building the ACE, the minutes of the relevant committee, is that Commander Sir Edward Travis of the Foreign Office will give his support. For a while, the plan was that the ACE be built by Chandler and Coombs at Dollis Hill. But that fell through. Turing grew disenchanted, went first to Cambridge, then to Manchester. Newman had gone from Bletchley Park to Manchester, where he took the chair of pure mathematics in October 1945. He took 2 members of his section, I.J. Good and David Rees, with him. PMS Blackett, who had been Director of Naval Operation Research during the war, and so was fully conversant with the Bletchley Park work, was already at Manchester. He encouraged Newman to apply to the Royal Society for a grant for a projected calculating machine laboratory at Manchester University. Professor Hartree, who is often credited with having played a very important role in promoting and obtaining support for the first post-war computer developments in Britain, particularly those at Cambridge, was closely involved in these matters. Apparently, he visited Bletchley Park shortly after the end of the war to see the colossi. the invitation having been made expressly to gain his support for the proposed project. The Royal Society grant was awarded in July 46. Blackett also had a hand in getting F.C. Williams to Manchester from the Telecommunications Research Establishment in late 46, who in turn arranged that Tom Kilburn should join them shortly afterwards. Newman taught the basic principles of von Neumann's stored program computer to Williams and Kilburn. Within 18 months, they had designed and built an experimental prototype stored program electronic computer believed to be the world's first. Not a practical machine, but a stored program machine. The work was therefore quite advanced when Turing arrived in September 48, and he took not too great a part there. But he did do some programming, wrote the first Manchester programming manual. Newman also had some involvement with programming, but has one notable claim to fame with respect to computer design, that of being an inventor of the index register. Flowers and Broadhurst spent their later careers in electronic telephone design. Chandler and Coombs worked on pattern recognition machines, and so met Mickey. Let me conclude as follows. Goldstein has expressed surprise that despite the ravages of war, Great Britain had such vitality that it could immediately after the war embark on so many well-conceived and well-executed projects in the computer field. It is my opinion that the Colossus project was one of the important sources of this vitality, both technical and political, one that has to date been largely unappreciated, as has the significance of its place in the chronology of the invention of the digital computer. It's very difficult to summarize it because of the continuing secrecy about some aspects of the machine. So let me end by just quoting statements from two of the people involved. From Broadhurst. The basic picture. A few mathematicians of high repute in their own field accidentally encounter a group of telephone engineers, of all people. And they found the one really enthusiastic expert in the form of Flowers, who had a good team with him, and made these jobs possible with, I think, a lot of mutual respect on both sides. And the post office was able to supply the men, the material, and the maintenance without any trouble, which is a great tribute to the men in the organization. Flowers. The value of the work, I am sure, to engineers like myself, and possibly to mathematicians like Alan Turing, was that we acquired a new understanding of and familiarity with logical switching and processing because of the enhanced possibilities brought about by electronic technologies which we ourselves developed. Thus, when stored program computers became known to us, we were able to go right ahead with their development. And finally, from Flowers, it was a great time in my life. It spoilt me for when I came back to mundane things with ordinary people. Thank you.